Hey, what's up? I'm Colin, and today we'll talk through the top 10 mistakes that first-time home builders make when they're building their first barndominium. Let's check it out. All right, well, mistake number one comes down to not doing your homework up front and having a plan in place before you start your project. Most home buyers for the first time or home builders assume that they can just go out there and buy the land, put whatever they want on it, and it's no problem. Unfortunately, the reality is that that's not always the case, especially if you're looking at a property that's in an HOA, maybe even in city limits or county limits or things like that. Different areas have different build restrictions. When it comes to building a barndominium, because this is typically a metal structure, it's a different style building than a standard house. You may need to make sure that you actually have the right ability to build the house type that you want there. If you don't have the right zoning, you're going to have a problem from the start, and you may have ended up buying land that you can't use. So before you get that land in the first place, make sure you can actually do with it what you want. Just because you buy it doesn't mean you can do whatever. So beyond that, really it comes down to making sure that you've got the right utilities in place. So like electric, water, things like that. Typically, barndominiums go in places like rural settings, which may mean that you have to drill a well, which is probably something you've accounted for. But again, just do your homework on that and make sure that you've got the budget in place for that on top of building the house. But then also beyond that, running power. One of the interesting things that I've learned when working on real estate is that some of these rural places don't have lines out there. You may have to run a line quite a ways out depending on how rural you're getting. So make sure you account for that. If the property doesn't have power or power nearby, that may be a surprise expense. So make sure you do your homework up front, have an understanding of what those utilities would cost before you buy that property, if that's something you're considering. If you already own the property, again, before you start building, just make sure that's something you can actually account for. So, do your homework. Number 2, hiring the wrong contractor. I know this sounds a little bit weird because one of the things that barndominiums are sold as is basically a cheap way to build a house. And so we think that any home building contractor can go out there and do this. The reality is that barndominiums typically follow more of a process in line with a commercial building, especially if we're going the steel route with these buildings. So before you go in there and just assume that you can hire any old regular builder for this project, make sure you have one in your area that you can contract with and work well with. It actually has either specialized in this before, has experience with this building material type, or can do that homework and confidently do your project. I live here in Central Florida, and the project I've been involved with a family member, that was one of the kind of surprises up front. Is these are great, they were at the time big across the Midwest. There are people doing these in some of the rural areas, but unfortunately here in Central Florida, we really struggled to find a builder that could do this project. And unfortunately, the builder they went with, while I think he's a great guy, hadn't done this before. So maybe some of those cost savings weren't something that we captured up front, simply because it is a learning project. And that's something to keep in mind when we're looking at this for the first time, especially if this is a budget-conscious project, is making sure that we're actually approaching this with the mindset of we've got the right team in place that's capable of doing it and doing that confidently. So number 2, make sure you get the right contractor. And again, just because they're in residential and this is a house for you doesn't mean that it's the same process as building a house. There are steps to that, but erecting the barn and working with that, make sure you got the right team. All right, number 3, setting unrealistic budgets. I think a lot of this plays into the mindset that this is just a cheap way to build a house. The reality is that is not at all the case. The first area in this project I want to tackle is that so many of us rely on the internet, particularly forums, YouTube, places like that, to get our idea of budgeting and what this looks like. The reality is that's very different across the country. So if I'm building here in Central Florida where I'm at, my prices are going to be vastly different than maybe a rural town in Georgia or the Midwest or somewhere like that. If you're building in California, obviously there's very different building codes there versus here, different building expenses. And I think this is one of those areas that the project I'm involved with got really thrown off early on. The home builder relied on using those forums and Reddit and places like that for this is a cheap way to build a house. And the reality is they did it for $100 a square foot in maybe 2015. did a lot of the work themselves. This home builder was doing the work in Central Florida, hiring a team out here in 2025 when this is a booming market. The reality is that $100 a square foot in the middle of nowhere, rural town where build costs are very low, was more like $220, $230 a square foot to build here in Central Florida. So the reality is it's not any really different savings, especially once you get into the actual house building part of the framing, drywall, putting in a kitchen, things like that this homeowner wanted. Bought that idea of this is a cheap build, here's what they did it for in this area, not accounting for the fact that here in Central Florida those prices are different. So be mindful of where you're at, especially if you're using the internet to get an idea of what pricing is. Don't always just take that low number and think, well, that's what I'm going to do. You know, it costs this person, $50 to put in all of their electricity. That's not a reality. And that's one of those areas you'll be really disappointed unless you just happen to live in one of those great areas. So do your homework, make sure the numbers actually are what they are for your area when you're doing that budgeting. And again, when you're sitting down to talk to your contractor about this, I encourage everyone, get that line item sheet once you're actually agreed to, here's what we're doing, here's what the numbers are. What does that break out like? So I can come in here and say, I know that my electric budget, can't really touch that, but I know it's about accurate. I know that maybe my kitchen budget's a little bit high, so I've got some wiggle room here, or maybe it's a little bit low. Maybe, you want to go in with granite and things like that, quartz, whatever the case may be, high iron finishes, backsplashes, whatever. If you've only got $15,000 for that, maybe a little bit tight. You're going to go over budget there. So check your numbers, make sure that you actually do the proper budget planning in place. This applies really to anybody building a home, but in barndominiums in particular, so many of us think cheap home, which means I'm going to save on everything. Your kitchen is still going to be the cost of a kitchen, unless you're just really lucky and have a dad or granddad or aunt, cousin, somebody that can build your cabinets for you and donate them. You're still going to have to buy them. They're not just going to magically be cheaper because you slap Barndominium on the project. So just be realistic with your numbers. If you're not, you're in for some really big shocks, and that's not a fun area to be. Do your homework, keep your numbers right. Number 4, checking out the right floor plan. Floor plans are probably one of the most critical parts of the project once you make sure you can actually build what you want in your area. You've got the right builder, you've got the right place. Your floor plan is what you live in. It's what the house ultimately ends up looking like. And this is an area that, again, whether it's a barndominium, whether it's a regular standard house, whether it's an office, no matter what it is you're building, having the right plan is going to be what sets up for success in the future. Do your homework, take your time, and get it right. One of the areas I wanted to call out that I thought was interesting as somebody who kind of helped design on this project, the floor plan and lay it out, that was interesting to note that I wanted to share is that when we're looking at barndominiums, we often tend to see projects that get very large. In the case I was working on, my cousin built a 50 by 50 foot square structure. And while that's great, it gave a lot of square footage. The house ended up being, I think, 3,600 square feet total by the time they added a second floor and did some stuff there. The reality is that how it laid out the way they wanted it to, you ended up either with giant ballrooms, which are great, but when you have a 40 by 40 living room, there's a point where it's a little ridiculous, and there's only so much room a couch and some coffee tables and all can take up. So that wasn't really a great design. We had some other options that their architect drew for them that had tons of hallways through it, which again have a lot of wasted space. I had worked out a couple designs that had maybe some cutouts in them and all, but ultimately what happened is they ended up, and by their own choice, you had a central kind of cave-like room that while you have a centralized family room, there's no windows to it. So having these large squares sometimes give you that dead space in the middle of the home where it's just really hard to make these layouts. Whereas, in a standard home, if I wanted to, bump the bathroom out and give it a window or whatever, you have more opportunities for changes in the dynamics of that structure. Whereas you can't do that with a barn, especially if it's a square structure or rectangle. So just make sure that before you get stuck and committed to a specific shell size or something like that, it actually works. Fortunately, you have lots of options. Most barn providers have all different shapes. But I would really encourage, if you're going with a larger structure, definitely try to consider something like a rectangle, just to keep it from having those large dead spaces in the middle. And again, It's great to have open layouts. I'm all for having a house that's welcoming for entertaining. But you just really, there's a point where you get too much space. You don't want to have a 50 by 50 living room unless that's specifically what you're looking for and there's a need there. Again, be mindful you have to fill the space. I think that's another surprise. People go build these huge houses and then forget, I've got to buy furniture for a 5,000 square foot house now. That's expensive. So just keep those things in mind when you're designing your plan. Go with the right shape based on what you want, and then understand there may be some trade-offs there that are a little bit unique based on that structure type. So just get your plan right, take your time. There's an important reason why we'll call out in just a second. So why is all that really important? Because the barndominium is the exterior of your home, and that's number 5, getting the exterior right. So when it comes to the exterior of your barndominium, this is the metal structure you're actually going to be ordering from the builder. This is something I found out kind of the hard way in my cousin's project. He had committed to buying this barn. They worked on the design. It worked out great. Unfortunately, once the barn was sitting on their property, they realized we underestimated cost to build a house, taking these optimistic numbers, and now I need to change it, except I've got the structure sitting over here. I think you can probably see where this is going. If you don't get your design right, once you have that exterior with the barndominium, unlike a standard home, I can't just slap siding over this and frame in a window or whatever. I've got a metal cutout here for a window that I'm committed to. There's not really a clean, easy way other than getting a new metal panel or screwing a new cover up over it. It's not like a standard house where I can just slide the siding in or stucco over it. It's never there to begin with. And once you have that barn structure, that's the exterior you're committed to, really, unless you take drastic changes to change it. So one of the things I would really encourage you is get the exterior right, and then make sure that actually complements the interior as well. One of the things that I think we forgot about in this project, at least the homeowner forgot about, is that the interior dictates what the exterior looks like. So if I put a window here that looks great on the inside and it's off center on the outside, I need to change some things around, or I live with having some lopsided structure. So when it comes to your exterior, get it right. Make sure you have those renderings of this is how this lays out, where my windows lay out, things like that, especially on your elevations like your front. If that's important, obviously that's your street side of it. And then even maybe the rear, if that's where you're going to be entertaining, if the rear is as important to you. But remember, once you order that barn, that's kind of what you're committed to. You can't change so much. You're not going to be able to shuffle your windows around. Not that you really should do that in a stick build to begin with, but there's a different level of commitment there that I think a lot of people freak out about once you order that barn kit. If you're somebody who's going to make change orders, don't order it until you say, this is absolutely what I'm doing, I'm committed, and we're ready to go. So get the exterior right, otherwise you're in for big trouble. So number 6 is DIY disasters. Again, going back to that mentality that these are cheap homes, I think so many of us forget that these numbers that we see that we love on places like Reddit often have a DIY, somebody who's in the construction industry. They grew up around building things, they know how to do this kind of work, they're good with their hands. That's great, except the average homeowner doesn't think through, like, these are not just weekend warrior projects. If you're to commit to subcontracting a project out to yourself, you need to make sure you can, 1, do the work and actually follow through on it, but 2, do it within a deadline. If you're working with a construction company and you decide you're going to contract out doing the drywall yourself or painting or doing your baseboards or things like that, if it's something that impacts a project down the road, you'll have a set time period that you have to complete that in, and if you don't, it impacts that, which means your builder's now impacted, their teams are impacted, this just snowballs down the road, and that's not something you can do, at least not without having some fines and things like that. So be mindful if you're going to commit to doing a DIY version of this home yourself, if that's something your builder will allow, make sure you can both do it and actually do it within the time frame you're allotted. On that third point, one of the things that most home buyers and builders are surprised by is that not every builder will let you do self-contracted work. That's something that's a big deal for me. When I do build my own home, there are certain things that I want done a certain way that a builder is not going to do, simply because they don't do them that way anymore, and most have lost that art. But when it comes to building a barndominium, things like drywall, tile, whatever, They'll have teams that can do that as long as you're not being me and trying to be weird with building a Victorian house. The reality is that if they can do it, they're going to want to do it themselves, especially those critical things. There's things like inspections and code and all that you have to deal with, obviously. And you don't want to cause a problem for that. If you don't know those things, don't opt for it. Definitely would not recommend taking on electric and plumbing and some of those crazy ideas. Let the professionals handle that, unless you know what you're doing. But just be mindful again that if you're going to do it yourself, commit to it. Otherwise, you're in for a disaster, and it's just going to make everybody upset. On that note, number 7 is underestimating finishing costs. So when we're talking about building a house in general, there's certain things that we know we're going to have. We're probably going to have doors. We're going to have trim. We're going to have showers and toilets and kitchen cabinets, and the list just keeps adding up and getting more and more expensive. So when we look at these things, don't just again have that mentality of this is a cheap house, everything's cheaper. Your kitchen's still going to cost what the kitchen costs. And I said that earlier, but I'm going to say it again because that's an area that so many of us forget and get sticker shocked at how expensive it costs to have these nice big kitchens that we love and saw on Pinterest. So when it comes to really estimating your costs, make sure you're realistic. Make sure you understand that this is what my budget is. This is what falls within that budget. I can shuffle things around and elevate this, or I don't really need these things. I'll do it later. But really, I think one of the things I want to call out here, because so many people ask these questions when building the first time, and it's something that I did when I started researching as well, is what if I cut back on areas like instead of 16-inch on center studs, I just did 24? Or maybe I didn't go with, that high-end insulation. They recommended spray foam. What if I didn't do that or whatever? What I want to caution so many of you on is making sure that you're not cutting costs in areas that you can't go back and change later. What I mean by that is it is a whole lot easier to go in and add under cabinet lighting to your kitchen 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whenever from now. I probably can't go into that wall back there and change the insulation out in it. I could, but I'm ripping that drywall out and taking the pictures off. I'm making a huge mess. I'm going to put it all back up. It is so much more work and so much more expensive than had I just done that right the first time with the insulation that I wanted long term. These are areas to make your investments. Doing things like changing the ceiling fans out, whatever, that's not a big deal. We can always cap this off and add that light later. Most of you are probably handy enough to do that. So make sure you invest your money right. Don't go spend crazy money on, chandeliers, for example, and then skimp out on your insulation. That doesn't make any sense. Your walls, again, if you want to have flimsy mobile home walls, go with the cheapest option. But why do you want that? It's not really worth it. Save the money. Do those things that you really want down the road you can do later, and invest in them when you have the money. You can't change your walls once they're up. Invest wisely. Bonus note, one of the things I want to call out is that barndominiums tend to have a little bit larger floor plans than maybe what you would have gone for in a traditional build house. At least that's part of the appeal with them. But remember that when it comes to building, things like that cost per square foot go up the more house you have. So what I mean by that is that when you have $1 per square foot difference in flooring, take $3 a square foot flooring in a 1,000 square foot house, you'll have $3,000 worth of flooring, whereas a $7 a square foot piece of flooring is going to be $7,000. That's only $4 difference per square foot, but the reality is you've got several $1,000s difference there on that flooring project. So be mindful of how that plays out, especially in a larger home that does grow exponentially. You'll probably want to have some type of flooring throughout your house, for example. So just make sure that you actually count for that. If I'm going to go with a really big house, I've got to fill it, I've got to cover the floors, things like that. Your expenses do grow exponentially once you're there. Number 8, relying too much on Pinterest and social media. I get it. So many of us get inspired by going to these sites and getting these really cool ideas. But again, you're going to see these mentalities of this is a cheap way to build, but Pinterest is going to show you these really expensive options like wooden beams with, maybe knotty cypress or something like that. It's really cool. But the reality is that's an expensive material. You're going to see these great, huge kitchens with gorgeous cabinets. And the reality is that's really expensive. Things like glass and the double stacked cabinets and maybe some of those areas that maybe we love and they look good, but that doesn't align with that cheap narrative. So if you commit too much to the Pinterest and places like that without actually shopping them, you're going to be in for a surprise. I would say get your inspirations, get a general idea, but be realistic. Number 9 comes down to climate control. Really 2 factors here I want to talk on. We'll make it pretty quick. The reality is that metal buildings are going to be very different than a standard block or stick-built home. So just make sure you get the right insulation. Fortunately, in the project I'm involved in, this is an area they did choose to invest in wisely. Went with spray insulation. That's a pretty popular recommendation you'll see. But make sure that you go with that, the right option here, whether you're in the Northeast or Northwest or down here south in Florida. Keeping your home warm or cool or both is definitely important. So make sure you invest wisely in insulation and account for the fact that this is a little bit different building style than a traditional home. The second note, again, goes into that square footage side of it. If you go with a larger home, be mindful that you may need to have multiple air conditioners or things like that. Again, unfortunately, this was a surprise area for the project I'm involved in. You get a 3,700 square foot 2-story house. You got air conditioners and stuff, and typically a couple of them with different zonings and all, and that gets really expensive. So just because the structure is cheap doesn't mean the way to do the air conditioning and things like that. That adds up really quickly. So just be mindful of your climate planning when you're doing your project. So number 10 is the uncomfortable conversation about making sure that we're mindful of resale value and the appeal of the home overall. I know that for many of you, this is going to be like your homestead option. It's going to be where you raise a family. You're going to have multiple generations here. You plan to retire here and your kids to retire here. And that's a great idea. But one of the things that we do need to account for is that there may be emergencies in life where that doesn't always work out. If you build a house that's not appealing, doesn't have curb appeal, and it's got a weird layout or things like that, it may be a little bit harder. So I'm not at all saying don't get what you want to make somebody else down the road happy. That's not at all where we're going with this. But what I am saying is keep some of those mindset of I want to make sure my house is actually something that I can sell in the future, which means doing things right, getting those right permits and all. It's a lot harder to be an emergency down the road where maybe we do need to move. There's a job change or something like that we didn't anticipate. And all of a sudden I'm stuck with this structure that I've got a mortgage on or something and I can't get out from under it. On that note, do be mindful that depending on where you're at, it may be hard to get either insurance or a mortgage or things like that on your structure. So just account for that before your project starts and make sure that you go with either a specialized Barndominium loan lender and get that in place before you start. So that way you actually are able to fund your project. It's not good to have all these hopes and dreams, get started with a plan, invest a little bit of money, and then realize I can't get funding. So do your research up front, make sure that you actually have a path for that, and you'll be a lot better off when you build your project. Good luck. If you'd like this video, like and subscribe. Looking forward to doing more content. If there's something you'd like to know about building a Barndominium and the things that we've learned along the way, drop a note in the comments below. Hit the bell for a reminder, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.